I'm Patrick McLamey, author of Designing a World-Class Architecture Firm and former CEO of HOK, and you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Like the Dos Equis commercials, we don't always feature classicists, but when we do, we go for the best. On our show today, we welcome one of America's foremost classical architecture advocates, David Brussat. He's a journalist and the author of Lost Providence. Later on, we'll hear from special returning musical guest Peter Lamb and the Wolves. And now he's somewhat bleary-eyed after watching a robot chicken marathon. Your host, George Smart.
Hi, folks. Yes, I've been recording Robot Chicken. It's my great new guilty pleasure on the DVR. If you don't know about this show, it's just kind of a mindless sketch show. It's only 15 minutes long. It comes on absurdly late at night, but you can record it. And it's really one little short, humorous sketch after another. And if it doesn't make you laugh, the next one will. It's pretty great. If you've been following our Instagram feeds, US Modernist or Mr. Modernism, you know that for the last 6 months, we've been giving away architecture books and DVDs every single day. Just like 1990s FM radio, all you have to do is be the first caller when posts go up. These calls go directly to me, and I love talking to everybody. And people love the books. Even devoted classicists are thrilled to win. For many, it's the first time they've won anything. And a really interesting thing has started to happen. People are asking to donate these coffee table-style architecture books they love, but no longer want and can't bear to throw away. The answer is yes. We'll assure they get to new fans, and we'll pay for the shipping. All you have to do is put the books in a box. Plus, you get a great tax deduction. To learn more, write me at george@usmodernist.org. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from Modernist realtor Angela Roll.
In a timeless adventure that we are largely making up, realtor Angela Roll grew up in Switzerland. That's right. She was the daughter of a former hacker wrongly accused for spying for the Russians. An Olympic skier, she skied across the border into France by mistake, causing an avalanche that completely buried the very first French Waffle House.
Mon Dieu!
At age 18, following a career-ending injury involving a little red dress, a wood-turning lathe, Cristal champagne, and a duck, Angela studied architecture by day and partied with Courvoisier's former neighbor, roofer to the stars, Bjarke Shingles, by night. When Bjarke left the lucrative world of celebrity roofing to start a new cheese company, Bjarke Shingles Singles, Angela decided to pivot.
By far the most overused word of 2020.
To a new career in real estate. As one of the few specialty modernist agents with architecture training, Angela deftly deals with unreasonable sellers, unrealistic buyers, incompetent builders, and slow bureaucrats, while connecting people to the modernist houses of their dreams. And she can get you a great deal on cheese. Modernist realtor Angela Roll is your special agent. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550.
Thank you, Tom. Let's be honest. Like NASCAR and sushi, modernism just isn't for everyone. Over the years, we've had on some great guests who, as the expression goes, are just not that into it. They see modernism as an invading style that has attacked the timeless classical building tradition, with structures variously seen as ugly, inefficient, disliked, and even offensive. We've had on Justin Shubo, head of the National Civic Arts Society, and Professor J.S. Curl, author of Making Dystopia, and we just missed talking to the great British classicist Roger Scruton, who passed away. Today it's my pleasure to welcome the Dr. Downtown of Providence, Rhode Island, journalist David Brussat. Such a cool nickname. David runs the blog Architecture Here and There and wrote for 30 years for the Providence Journal. He is the author of the book Lost Providence, and he's received the Oscar of Classicism, the Arthur Ross Award from the Institute for Classical Architecture. That's a big deal. Prince Charles won that award.
Wow.
David is a tireless advocate for the return of classical design to public architecture, and apparently loves taking Mrs. Downtown to something called Waterfire, which we'll find out about. And he's taken one more formal architecture course than I have, which is 0. Welcome, David.
Thank you, George. It's great to be here. I wish people would call me Dr. Downtown more, and I could perhaps facilitate that by writing more Dr. Downtown columns as posts, but they were intensely local when I was writing them.
Well, it's a great title. Great title.
It was called Ask Dr. Downtown, and I would actually write the questions because so few people would write to me asking me questions, and try to get the letter writers to fight with each other. And
when you were doing all the letter writing?
That was when I was writing a column a week, which I did for about 25 years at the Journal.
So you were like the Dear Abby advice columnist, too, I guess.
Not quite as widely read.
But were your topics specifically architecture related, or my son won't clean up his bedroom kind of?
They were mainly architecture related, but they sometimes brushed elbows with the likes of politics at the local level. And speaking of which, it just occurred to me that modernism and shingles go well together.
We'll have to explore that more.
You mean the medical malady or the roofing material?
I mean the medical malady.
Oh, really?
Okay.
Oh, I get it.
Yeah.
Nikos Salangaros has written often about the extent to which modern architecture not just disorients people, but makes them dizzy and makes them ill. But I don't think even he has ever suggested that modern architecture causes shingles.
That's good.
Fortunately, there's a new treatment out for shingles, which modernists can partake of if they feel the need.
What's that?
Well, it's a shot that you get. It's it's a prophylactic, so to speak.
I think I've gotten that.
Yeah, I just got that about a year ago.
Yeah, you don't want to get shingles, that's for sure.
A friend of mine just got shingles of the skull, and it was really terrible.
Oh, my
terrible.
gosh.
But aren't we getting a little off topic?
We
Perhaps.
David, before we get started, let's talk about one thing which I'm pretty sure we can agree on. And that's Madison Square Garden's replacement of Penn Station in the 60s was a huge mistake.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, whenever I write about that, I refer to the wonderful line by the great architecture critic and college professor whose name I'm trying to think of, Vincent
Scully, yes.
And he said that we once entered the city like gods. Now we scuttle out like rats.
Oh, man.
That is so accurate for Madison Square Garden and that train station.
Right. And for New York in general, as far as rats are concerned.
I've actually written a lot about that proposal by the National Civic Arts Society, led by Justin Shubo. I've written about that project, and it would be a wonderful project, far better than the recent construction by Robert A.M. Stern of the two college campuses in Yale. And that's because people would see it all the time. Who goes to Yale except for Yaleys?
True.
And then they disperse to the rest of the country and forget about their wonderful, wonderful new digs, which I think could make them a lot of money in donations in the out years, alumni donations. But colleges never think of that. They always build these stark modernist constructions that no one can imagine having a sort of a love affair under the staircase or anything like that, or in a closet. And so when it comes time for a graduate who is now rolling in money to make a donation to his old college, I'm sure his donation would be, or would have been, 3 or 4 times higher if the college of his choice had abandoned modernism and went back to the old standby classicism, which is much more cuddly.
So you're saying that it's better to make out in a classic building?
Yeah, apparently.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Okay. Let's just cut to
You
the
don't have
chase
to worry about it falling.
Well, speaking of romance, David, tell me about Waterfire and why you're a fan, because I'm assuming from your lovely tributes that you take Mrs. Downtown to this.
As a matter of fact, you're probably referring to my essay, which I wrote many, many years ago, called Sex and Waterfire.
Yes.
And I was alluding to that famous Wall Street Journal headline, Budgets and Sex. And it gained a lot of readership, but it really wasn't about sex. It was only about budgets. And they just threw the word sex into the headline to attract readers. It was sort of like an early version of clickbait.
Right.
And so I would proudly place my essay, Sex and Waterfire, into the lists for the prize for the clickbaitist essay of 1994 or whenever it was. But yeah, on my first date, my first official date with my current wife, Victoria, we went on a gondola ride through Waterfire.
Tell us what Waterfire is for people that don't know.
Well, Waterfire, every month or every several weeks in the summertime, Providence burns itself down and then rebuilds itself. No, I'm only kidding, George. That's just a really, really bad joke. Actually, what Waterfire is, see, Providence reopened its rivers in 1990 to 1996. It reopened its rivers. They had been covered by roads and parking lots, and a wonderful classical set of bridges and river walks and parks was laid down over about a mile of the rivers which run between downtown and College Hill, which Brown University is on. And they're really, really wonderful, intimate rivers. I mean, like, you really couldn't put a Waterfire down the middle of, say, the Potomac River, or actually, where are you guys calling from?
North Carolina.
We have no major rivers in this part of the state.
The Eno and we have the Noose. But, yeah, they don't go through town.
And it's not like the fires on the Cuyahoga River outside Pittsburgh.
Oh, yeah. Those are different. Those were different.
Yeah, that's
fires.
different. These are actual every 50 feet or so, over an extent of a mile and a half, there are these braziers filled with wood, and men and women in black clothing come in black boats and light the fires. And then the fires are restoked every half an hour or so throughout the evening. And from the riverbank, excellent stereo systems play, I guess, what's called world music.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I mean, some of it is like opera, some of it is like, mostly it's relatively sedate music. It's not like music to dance to, really. So this started in 1994, and it's extended every summer and fall since then. And it actually goes from May to November every 2 or 3 weeks, depending on the tides, because the Providence River and the Woonasquatucket and the Mashassack River, which meet in the middle of Providence, are tidal rivers. I mean, you wouldn't want to do a Waterfire at low tide because that would just expose too much scum along the riverbanks. And the riverbanks are all made of concrete or actually granite abutments taken from one of the highways that was moved something like half a mile downriver. It used to split the middle of town, and they used a lot of these granite blocks used to hold up the highway. Now they line the riverbanks. And so the riverbanks aren't like muddy or anything like that.
They're using recycled materials in a way.
That's right. It's called daylighting, because what they did was they took a lot of what had covered up the rivers over the years.
How long were they covered up?
They were covered up in stages from something like 1844 through 1990. And by the end of the 19th century, they had reached the maximum coverage. They had farmers markets and parking lots and that sort of thing, basically on top of the river. You could tell that it was a river, but you couldn't tell that it was a bridge over the river. They had little slots running down the river at certain placements where you could actually go out into the traffic and look over the edge and see that there was water below.
How romantic.
And, well, that was very unromantic. And the situation that they have now, the situation that we have now, is largely thankful to this guy named Bill Warner, who was a sort of hippie architect, and unfortunately he passed away in 2011. But he is responsible for having designed the waterfront, the new waterfront, and he specifically designed it in a classical manner. People from all over the world come to see it now, and there probably wouldn't be a Waterfire if it weren't for Bill Warner's gentle sense of design. So people come from all over the world now to see Waterfire, and all up and down the eastern seaboard and throughout the United States. It's become a real attraction. Unfortunately, COVID has shut it off as if it were a light switch, and the leaders of Waterfire, primarily a guy named Barnaby Evans, is trying to get it started for sometime in the fall.
David, did you start out in architectural journalism, or did you shift into it from some other subject matter?
The history of my career is a dark and dingy subject. I went to 4 colleges, 3 journalism schools before I got my degree from American University. And then I went into copyboyhood and dictationist at the AP Bureau in Washington, which thankfully I wasn't able to advance beyond that point, because I probably would have made a lousy reporter. But what I really wanted to do was write little essays of the sort that I had read most of my life. So I tried to find some newspaper that would hire me to write editorials. And so that's how I started my career at the Augusta Chronicle in Georgia, which was a delightful little town with the Masters tournament.
The Masters, sure.
And a charming little town, but the newspaper there made me take an $8,000 pay cut from what I was making as a copy boy at the Associated Press, or a dictationist. Do you know what a dictationist does?
Someone who takes dictation?
Yeah, someone who takes dictation. That's exactly right.
Somebody who knows shorthand?
And I did that for 3 years. It was a wonderful job. They were transitioning to computers then at the Associated Press, and nobody needed the dictationist anymore. And so I just sat in the corner and read.
But
all
still
day.
Pulled in that fat paycheck.
That's right. That's right.
Well, what shifted you into architectural journalism?
So architectural journalism, I didn't start writing about architecture until 1990. At that point, I was at the Providence Journal. I had been there for 4 or 5 years, writing on political and cultural subjects, including a weekly column. And we got a new editor who I will not name, although you perhaps have heard his name. Anyway, his first act, even though I had basically gotten him the job at the Journal, was to kill my column. And I think that he regretted that there was another staffer who wrote as well as he did, or at least I think he did. He was a good writer, but he didn't want the competition. That's the only explanation I have been able to come up with through the whole of my life. And anyway, he killed my column, and for a year I went without a column. And then he said, "Dave, I want you to do page layout," which I love doing, but which I didn't see as my career. I said I'd do it if you give me my column back, but I won't write about politics. And so he allowed me to write a weekly column about architecture. That started in 1990 or 1991, and I did it until the Journal was purchased by a rascally newspaper combine called Gatehouse. And soon enough, they decided that I didn't need to be there writing editorials anymore. And so I left in 2014 after having written architecture columns weekly for 25 years. And in 2009, I started my blog, Architecture Here and There, and have written that ever since.
You were one of the longest-running journalists of architecture in one of the smaller towns. I mean, most towns the size of Providence didn't have someone of your stature writing every week.
That's right. Someone figured that there were about, this is like in 2005 or something like that, about 50 dedicated, that is, hired in order to write architectural criticism. About 50 papers in the country had an architecture critic. So I was considered as being among those architecture critics. But I was the only one who wrote from a standpoint of applauding classicism and denouncing modernism.
Well, I've read that you've said, and I may be paraphrasing this wrong, but you've said that architecture started to tilt towards modernism around 1962. What happened then?
Well, I think what 1962 refers to is the federal guidelines for architecture in Washington and in courthouses around the country, written in 1962 by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who subsequently became a U.S. Senator. And those guidelines were tilted toward modern architecture. But modern architecture was already the establishment in the United States, and that goes back to probably the post-war years, the late 1940s. And until then, modern architecture had been advancing through Europe and advancing through the United States very, very slowly. A modern army that actually wasn't doing very well. In fact, in 1931, which was oddly enough the same year as that famous exhibition on modern architecture.
The Philip Johnson exhibition.
Yeah, at the Museum of Modern Art. It was the same year, or maybe the year after, that he wrote an editorial saying that any housing project designed by Le Corbusier would gather more guffaws than applause. And he was wrong, unfortunately, because in the 1930s, modern architecture picked up speed both in Europe and in the United States. Of course, there was a bit of a slowdown in building in the Depression years and in World War II, but after World War II, a lot of building took place, and it was mostly modern by that point, and modernism took over the American Institute of Architecture, and modernism took over almost all of the professions. Modernism took over all architecture schools, and by 1962 is pretty much the establishment, and quite natural, if quite regrettable, for the federal authorities at the General Services Administration, which designed and built all federal buildings throughout the country. They decided to go with modernism, even though even then it was clear that most people preferred traditional buildings, houses that looked like houses, churches that looked like churches, city halls that looked like city halls, museums that looked like museums.
Well, how do you determine something like that, though? Do you take a poll?
How do you determine...
well, what people like?
Well, one of the main determinants is the one market that remains solidly in the traditional line, which is housing. Unlike most office buildings and college buildings and government buildings, which are chosen by commission or committee, people choose to design their own houses. And if they can't afford that, they go out into the marketplace of existing houses and choose houses, and mostly, almost entirely, what they choose is traditional architecture. There has been resistance to that, but it's been very small, unlike in most commissions where you have modernists dominating the market for reasons that are very complicated and very tedious and very sad and very costly. People generally have the power to choose their own houses, and the fact that the market for houses and house design in the United States is very traditional is probably the biggest factor by which you can judge that most people favor traditional architecture over modern architecture. But there have been studies, like, for example, there's a famous study put out by the AIA, I think it was 2005, it was for their 150th anniversary. They hired a polling company to construct a survey that chose the 150 favorite buildings of Americans.
Right.
And this was sort of a double-blind study because the first cut was taken by people who were members of the AIA. And then only when their favorites were determined was a selection from those favorites offered to the public to choose. And I'm not sure exactly how many people were in the study, either public or architects. But even after that second tier of the survey, by far the dominant architectural preference was for traditional buildings. All of the first 10 were traditional buildings except for the Twin Towers, which were probably in there for sentimental reasons because they had just been knocked down, and Saarinen's Arch in St. Louis,
Sure.
which was undeniably modern and undeniably beautiful. But while modern architecture attained a certain preference among the sort of last 50 or 75 slots in the 150 favorite buildings, tradition dominated the first 75.
Okay. Well, Tom and I have both taken our anti-anxiety meds, so I want to ask you this question. What's wrong with modernism, David? I mean, why is it a bad thing? Why is modernist construction not a good thing?
I think largely it has to do with two factors. Number one is its general aesthetic sterility, which most people perceive naturally. But there are strong scientific bases for the public's belief that modern architecture is somehow, they have a strong skepticism of it. And number two, I think that largely because of this, and largely because modern architecture is a phenomenon that sort of took over a successful industry of building design and turned it into an unsuccessful industry. That is, it ended up with ugly cities, ugly buildings, and a sort of dour acceptance of reality by the public, which was not overjoyed. I mean, where does the public go when it wants to go on vacation? It goes to places like, Paris or Rome or London, for all its current flaws. It doesn't go to modernist places like Brasilia, to the suburbs of Paris. There are no modernist tourist attractions except for the Guggenheim Museum. And the reason is obvious, because people generally tend to feel uncomfortable.
So say more about that, David. I want to get to more specific, because you talked about some sort of general objections to it, but what is it that you're trying to describe about people's reactions or their response to it viscerally?
Well, I think as Salangaros has determined scientifically.
Dr. Salangaros? I don't know Dr. Salangaros.
Dr. Nikos Salangaros, he is a professor of mathematics and urban theory at the University of Texas, and he has studied neurobiology, among other things, and he's also been a 25-year collaborator with Christopher Alexander, who has done marvelous work trying to understand patterns of architecture. And not only that, but patterns of, computer electronics, which basically gave us Wikipedia, gave us Google, and gave us a lot of other things that are useful now, because those things are based on patterns also. I don't understand them in the least, but I do understand Salangaros' suggestion that man's brain has evolved since the early years. I'm talking millions, or at least hundreds of thousands of years ago, on the savannas of Africa, to become very much attuned to detail in the environment. And what detail means in the environment could be as significant as being able to determine whether that thing protruding from the edge of a tree is the snout of a lion. You've got to be careful of that. And of things like that, there are all sorts of things. If you have a subsistence living in ancient times, in pre-ancient times, prehistorical times, men and women had to be very careful about their environment, because their environment could leap from behind a rock and kill them. So basically what Salangaros believes is that mankind became very attuned to various details and their meaning from way back in mankind's history. Since then, now that a lot of those natural dangers have disappeared from the average person's daily environment, the intensity of the brain's desire for detail and need for detail has transmogrified into something less based on life-saving and more based on aesthetics and pleasure.
Let me see if I understand, because I'm kind of lost here. So are you saying that modernism's lack of adornment and detail is somehow antithetical to the human experience?
I would say, broadly speaking, that's correct. The human experience at its most basic.
So we need to have buildings that jump out from behind a tree and attack you?
No, we need to have buildings that indicate if they are going to jump out and attack you.
Okay.
And basically what I mean by that, very vaguely, is that buildings that have steep cantilevers, as many museums now have, give people a sense of anxiety, even if they don't necessarily realize it.
Okay.
And maybe subconscious or subliminal. There's an anxiety to walking under a cantilevered element of a building that looks like it's designed in order to fall on you.
I see. So there's a kind of primal thing going on.
That's an extreme example, but if you ever walk down a long, unadorned hallway in a hospital, you'll understand that just the slightest of ornamental touches, whether it be rims around doorways, whether it be framed art, whether it be any other various type of ornament, can make a greater pleasure out of being rolled down the gurney toward the operating room.
Well, in your career, David, have you not seen...
These are all things that I think most people, except for architects who have had their common sense purged by their education and their aesthetic sense purged by education, I think most people, most average people, don't need to study this in order to understand it. It's part of their natural environment. People have grown up with architecture from babyhood, and it's one of the things that they can see and understand on a regular basis, on a daily basis, for years and years and years and years, and they come to understand what's useful and what's attractive and what's admirable about traditional architecture as opposed to experimental modern architecture, which is really very recent. And since modernism has these different trends where the big desire is to find some new way to express artistic creativity, that you have these buildings that change their form for no reason. I mean, a history of buildings that change in form not because of utility, but because of the wacky aesthetic preferences.
Well, David, let me ask you, I mean...
There are a lot of architects who believe that, and there are a lot of people who believe it intuitively, but wouldn't really have the words to actually describe it the way I've just described it, however ineffective that may be. But I think any rational being who looks out at the world is going to say people pick traditional, corporations and their committees pick modern. And that says something. It says something, I think, that is kind of scary in that sterility of the environment has long been a trait of dystopian movies, dystopian literature, and dystopian art. And that seems to be leading in the way of authoritarianism.
David, let me ask you, in your career this last 30 years, have you not seen modernism adapt? For instance, very few buildings are cold, long, sterile hallways with no adornment. I can think, for instance, of Ashkenazi Hospital in Indianapolis, which once I toured through that, and it's a super modernist building. I really wanted to stay there. I mean, it was the most extraordinary hospital I'd ever seen, and it was extremely warm with art and textures and adornment and plants and everywhere. Hasn't architecture evolved somewhat in terms of modernist style over the last 30 years?
Well, I think modernist style has evolved over the last 30 years and even over the last 60 or 100 years. But mainly the cry of, utility above all.
Form follows function? Are you thinking of that one?
Yeah, form follows function has been a number one, dubious in its intellectual content and negative in its impact on the aesthetic design of buildings and even to an extent on the utility of buildings. But I think I would ask you, what was your rationale for going to see this hospital? Were you a patient? Were you visiting a patient? Or did you come as a person who runs an organization called U.S. Modernism?
Well, obviously...
I mean, how unbiased was your attitude? Now, I'm not saying that there aren't really beautiful modernist buildings and beautiful long hospital hallways rendered elegant by modernist design. But I think that they're few and far between because it requires almost a genius level of intellect to be able to produce them. Whereas because classicism is usually based on copying the past, to use the modernist's favorite phrase, its methods of articulating beauty have changed slowly over the years and have been handed down by generations of architects in a process that is more thoughtful than the sort of experimental change that characterizes modernist creativity. I think modernist creativity basically can be summed up of let's try and find a way to do this that's never been done before. Whereas in traditional work, it's let's try and find a way to do this that takes advantage of things that we've already been doing in the past, but makes them somehow slightly better.
That gets to the root of my question, though. Has modernism gotten better over the last few years and become more adaptive so that it's not as jarring, say, as it was in 1962?
Well, I think it's become more jarring. And it's become more jarring because our modernist architects run up against the problem that all artists face, which is, that you have to do something new. I mean, over time, the number of new things that you can do runs out, and you have to do more extravagant things to maintain the theory, which I think is dubious to begin with, that your new creative novelty of this or that style is utilitarian. And in most discussions of modern architecture and its design, the idea of beauty for years and years and years has been pushed back in the closet and rarely discussed. Lately it's been discussed more, but more in the vein of why haven't we been discussing beauty?
Well, let's talk about something beautiful. You mentioned earlier the Saarinen Arch in St. Louis as being something that really worked. Mm-hmm. Are there any situations where modernist design works better than traditional design for public spaces?
Well, I don't know whether that's actually the case. You could make a case for airports in a way that you couldn't make a case for train stations, because train stations were originally developed before the onset of modernism, and you had some really beautiful train stations that were perfectly functional. Function and beauty were independent of each other. Now you have train stations like the Euston Station in London, which is so blockish and sterile and boring that the people are demanding that it be torn down and replaced at least with the original arch. But, I mean, that's an interesting question. Like, for example, are modernist hospitals, and practically all you have nowadays is modernist hospitals, are those more functional or are they just cheaper? And why are they cheaper? Are they cheaper because the materials or the construction process is intrinsically cheaper? Or is it more a matter of how the construction companies have decided they want to arrange the system of manufacture of buildings? I would just say it's the latter, but I don't really know that much about the subject.
Let's talk about memorials for a moment.
Sure.
How do you feel about the Frank Gehry designed Eisenhower Memorial, which is scheduled to open this September? For me, it seems a pretty bad compromise. It doesn't really have the wild look of a Gehry, and yet it doesn't appear very classical either.
Well, it doesn't have the wild look of Gehry. It's a lot more structured and less loopy than a typical Gehry museum or monument or brain research center or whatever, what have you. It's an intentional, and I've heard Gehry talk about this, it's intentional effort to poke traditional monuments in the eye. And regrettably, he has finally been able to worm his way into the architecture of Washington, D.C., which is, even with its excessive modern architecture, is still extraordinarily beautiful because the beauty of a traditional building, a classical building, such as the monuments and the federal buildings that we have in Washington, is so much more intense than the beauty, such as it may be, of modern architecture, which Washington's filled with. It's so much less intense. And I think Gehry's monument is an insult not only to architecture, but to Ike himself. It's not a monument to Dwight D. Eisenhower. It's a monument to Frank Gehry.
Well, I have to agree with you there that it certainly doesn't work the way I've seen the renderings of it. I mean, it could have gone full Gehry or something much more restrained, but it's going to be a bad compromise decision when it finishes up.
Well, it's not even a compromise, really. I don't see in what sense it could be described as even partly traditional. I mean, I don't see it at all.
Well, given the early sketches of this from 10 years ago, it's way different than it is now.
Yeah, well, it's long had traditional sculpture. So I made a mistake when I said that. I don't see anything in it that's traditional. Yeah, the sculpture is traditional, but I think they're 18-foot concrete pillars with no articulation that hold up the screen. There used to be more screens in the original design, and those were chipped away at. But the final screen, the one that stretches along the U.S. Department of Education, I think it is. A Washington Post writer recently wrote that it was very disappointing because you couldn't see what the subject was. It was done in the abstract mode of a Gehry sketch, and it really didn't convey anything at all during the daytime. And what it conveyed at nighttime, where you could actually see its outlines, was really basically incomprehensible.
Well, speaking of Washington, let's get to the big architecture news of 2020, the Making Federal Buildings Beautiful Again executive order.
Oh, yeah.
Which, as of this recording, is still not yet in effect. On February the 4th, this draft order was leaked to the AIA and Architecture Record, who, of course, voraciously opposed it. You've bemoaned the fact that some classicists have opposed it as well, and you're pushing them to mount a bigger fight.
Correct. Yes, that's right.
So what is this draft order all about, and why is it important to you?
Well, as I said, the guidelines that currently oversee the selection of architects, what they design, how it interacts with the community, all those things are guided by the principles that Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote out in 1962. And basically, although the guidelines say that, I'm not sure exactly how they put it, but an official style should be avoided, the result of the Moynihan guidelines was an official style. For the 30 or 40 years between the institution of those guidelines and, say, 1990 or 2000 or 2010, in that span of decades, 0 traditional buildings were built for the federal government.
No, wait a second. That's not true, David. I mean, there were many built in D.C. The Ronald Reagan building, for instance, is exceptionally traditional.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, they didn't wipe out classicism.
No, but they wiped out the use of classicism for federal architecture. I mean, the Ronald Reagan building, everyone recognized it would have been a slam on Reagan to have a building named by him that looked like a building designed by Frank Gehry or any number of modernist architects. So they built that as a classical building, plus it was right in the Federal Triangle there, which meant that it almost had to be classically designed, and it was. But from the standpoint of buildings out in the States and buildings in the city of Washington, there have been either no or almost no traditional buildings designed. And that suggests to me that whatever may have been the intent, the guidelines actually served as an official style.
You know, I've taken the time to read those regulations, and besides being incredibly boring, which they are, they're really promoting a diversity of styles, not recommending one thing over another. I mean, if there's somebody to be blamed for this, it's not the regulations, it's maybe the profession or the styles of the time, but I didn't see it in these regulations.
Are you talking about the regulations that are being proposed now or the ones from back in 1962?
No, the ones from 1962.
The ones from 1962 basically talk about contemporary style. Now, you can argue about the strict meaning of the word contemporary, but contemporary has come to be a synonym for modernism. And the regulations, which are not very long, say that the ideas on design should flow from the profession to the government and not the other way around, even though the government is supposed to represent the people. The guidelines are very short, and they have several points where if you changed a couple of words, you'd have something that was actually neutral. But as they stand, they aren't neutral. And to the extent that they're not neutral, they lean in the direction of modern architecture. And if you take 1962, at that point, modern architecture had been basically the establishment for almost 20 years. So it was understandable that the people who ran the GSA, which was also created, well, it was created in 1949, the people who ran the GSA were basically modernists, and so they let the profession take the lead, and the profession was dominated by modernists. I mean, it may be that there is a post office out in Podunk, Montana that is traditional and that was built between that period of 1962 and 2010, but I haven't seen a picture of it. I know you talk about the Ronald Reagan building, but the Ronald Reagan building was built within the context of the Federal Triangle and could not have been designed any other way than it was, except that it could have been made better than it was, more classical.
Well, I encourage all our listeners to do their own research on this. Look up the act from 1962. You can also go online and find the most recent proposed regulations and executive order, the Making Federal Buildings Beautiful Again. David, thank you so much for joining us. It's really nice to chat with you.
Well, I can't believe the time is all over now. I really, really enjoyed this.
Well, that's great.
I hope I wasn't unnecessarily belligerent in my explication of my views, but I am talking to the belly of the beast, so I'm sorry.
And we thank you for that, David.
Right.
And by the way, I wanted to fit in my deep, deep applause to you guys for your digital archive. I mean, that is an incredible resource.
Well, thank you. We're very happy to provide it to people.
Well, thanks for having me.
Coming up, Peter Lamb and the Wolves. Do you remember the TV show Ally McBeal? The future Mrs. Han Solo, Callista Flockhart, starred along with the future Mrs. Ellen DeGeneres, Portia de Rossi, in the late 90s adventures of young female attorneys fending off men like ducks on corn while pining for the ones that got away. Fun fact, singer Josh Groban got his big break to stardom on that show. The part I love most about Ally McBeal's episodes was the ending, which generally took place in the bar on the first floor where Mrs. Solo and her fellow attorneys worked. They would all gather to drown their heartache of the week and listen to the house singer Vonda Shepard. She could really belt it out. Here at U.S. Modernist, we have a house band too. They've performed at our annual super fun Mod Squad parties for years, and they were our first musical guests here on the podcast. Please welcome back Peter Lamb and the Wolves singing Temptation, written by the great Tom Waits.
follow you. My will has disappeared. Now my confusion's so clear. Temptation, oh, I can't resist, no.
Our studio audience.
Yeah, the first two albums are live on purpose.
With us is the group's leader, Peter Lamb. Hi, Peter.
Hi there. How you doing, George?
Hey, good. Your group has such a great name. I guess you rejected something like Peter Lamb and the Slaughter.
Yeah. Peter Lamb and the Police.
Right.
Yeah.
Peter Lamb and the Stones.
If you were a punk band, maybe Slaughter would work better.
My wife, Jessica Lamb, the fabulous Jessica Lamb, she came up with the name for the band, and it's stuck. The only problem is I don't know. Once you have a name, you can't change it. It's like being married, and you're a doctor, you can't change your last name. And I kind of don't like having my name in the band. I kind of wish the band had a different name without me in it. But yeah,
you could always change your name.
That's true.
Just a thought.
Yeah, I could be like Burt Bacharach, or somebody.
Right.
Totally.
Peter, I guess like every other performer, your booking schedule is pretty clear lately. How is it to be a musician in a pandemic?
It's a very interesting, different time. George, I'm 43, okay, and I've been playing music my whole life. And I was thinking about it recently. I've probably gigged every night, every week of my life since I was 20, at least 2 or 3 nights a week, until this year. And now I'm not gigging, and it's no one's gigging, and it's a very strange is the most obvious word, but I don't know how it is. There's a lot of time to practice. There's more time to practice than I've ever had, which is great. But what are we practicing for? There's no gigs, and the music that I play, which is primarily New Orleans jazz, it really needs to be done in a live setting, and doing like a Zoom thing or something online doesn't work well because there needs to be communication. It's like you're having a conversation with the people you're on stage with. And so unlike like a rock album, like the White Album or like Pink Floyd, you can do a lot of fun and cool things in the studio with rock and roll or classical music or samba or almost anything. But with jazz, it really has to be in person and live. So that's the weirdest part about all this. But I feel like I'm honing my craft well. I'm writing a lot of music. I'm teaching a lot, and if and when this is over, I feel like I'll be a better musician for it. Which hopefully that's a plus.
Is there a new album in the works?
There is a new album in the works. Actually, the new album was supposed to be recorded in 2020, but we're not recording it in 2020. Not yet, at least, because of the pandemic. Yes, there is. Okay. There's a lot of good stuff. A lot of originals, a few bizarro arrangements. I'm doing an arrangement of the Tumbling Tumbleweeds, which is like an old cowboy song, and just some bizarro things. I really like mixing my jazz up with just bizarro pop music from over the decades. So, but yes, there is an album in the works.
Tell me about the members of the band. Who are we hearing singing, for example, in that last tune?
So the vocalist in my band is Mark Wells. He's also the keyboardist and one of my dear friends. He's an incredible musician. He also plays guitar and some percussion. But he and I have been performing together for roughly 13 years. And again, every week for 13 years, 2 or 3 nights a week, we perform together. And we get along great. He's like a brother to me, and just a true inspiration. And he's got a voice like nobody's voice that I've ever heard. George, you can attest to that. He's just a phenomenal singer.
Yeah.
And also just a phenomenal piano player in person. The trumpet player in my band is my brother, my younger brother, Paul Rogers. We have a separate father. The new album will feature him a lot because on the previous 3 albums, we had a different trumpet player, a man named Al Strong, who is a truly remarkable musician also, but he's moved on and he's doing different things with different people. And my brother moved to town from Philadelphia, and we're using him now. On drums, we have Stephen Kaufman, who plays in the local band The Beast with Pierce Freelon, and he's the drummer for the North Carolina Rep Orchestra. And then the bass player in my band is Peter Kimosh. It used to be George Knott. George is the trio bass player that I use, but for the full 5-piece band, we use Peter Kimosh, who is a tremendously talented musician. Also, they're all very talented. I don't know, I shouldn't say that, but he's great too. So.
Yeah.
And then I play saxophone, and I write the arrangements, and I'm the boss man. So there that is. George, you said Josh Groban. I performed with Josh Groban at the PNC about 4 years ago.
Really?
Oh, cool.
You accompany him?
They hired me to do one song on his concert, and I was there for 7 or 8 hours at PNC, just backstage. I had to rehearse with him, and then I felt like a Beatle. There were like 15,000 streaming teenage girls.
Wow.
And I get on stage,
sure.
and there's Josh, and he's holding the microphone in front of my sax bell, and I play like this, I don't even know what I played. I mean, it was like 30 seconds of saxophone, and then they paid me remarkably well for my 30 seconds, and I got off stage, and he was a really great guy. He was a really nice person, and he totally killed it.
How often do gigs like that happen?
They happen off and on. I live here in the Triangle, and I'm kind of a big fish in a small pond. I think if I was in New York or Chicago, I wouldn't get as many calls as I do, but I tend to get a lot of phone calls when artists come to town. I'm on Ben Folds' last album, and I did a DVD with Clay Aiken, and just stuff like that, But they come, and I always jump on them because, you have to. But I don't seek them out. They seek me if they need a saxophone player, knock on wood. So.
Well, if I need a saxophone player, I'll be sure to call you.
Please do. Please do.
This next song, written by Irvin Berlin, has been recorded by Fred Astaire, Judy Garland, Ella Fitzgerald, Rufus Wainwright, and of course the sensational disco version made famous by Taco in 1983.
And Gene Wilder, don't forget Gene Wilder.
Oh, that's right.
Oh, yes, yeah. And of course Gene Wilder singing with legendary actor Peter Boyle, better known for playing Frank Barone on Everybody Loves Raymond, in the title role of young Frankenstein in Mel Brooks' classic film.
Yeah.
That's right.
Here we go with Peter and the Wolves on Putting on the Ritz. Hey, Peter, thank you so much. Come back and visit again when the new album's ready.
I will, George. Thank you for having me, and you stay safe. And I really dig your show. Thank you so much, man.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special real estate agent for Modernist Houses. Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 7,500 significant modernist houses, and access 3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Carrie Cesarino researches guests while juggling 2 above-average children, a baby crocodile, and a dusty bottle of Dom Perignon 1963. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another Make Modernism Great Again edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.